We got a fresh painting surface, a sketchbook full of ideas, and some acrylic paint. Are you ready to go on an adventure? This is Arty Field Trips. And today we're going to dive into the world of acrylic painting. We're going to find a fun design in the sketchbook, and we're going to draw it out on our painting surface, and we're going to get started. I've been really inspired by the dopamine aesthetic lately, so I want to find something really fun and colorful that reminds me of good things inside my sketchbook. But first, let's open up this gesso board. I haven't ever really used gesso boards, so I'm really excited to figure it out. I'm wondering how the paint will react with the surface. That's one reason why I got a smaller gesso board, is so I can kind of feel it out and see how it's going to work with the paint. I'm also painting with Arteza acrylic paint for the first time, and I don't know how that's really going to work either. So we have lots of things to discover in this video. Alright, let's crack this sketchbook open and find us a little friend to paint. Let's see if we can find a sweet little friend in here. I think I'm going to try to find a cupcake. I think cupcakes go well with the dopamine aesthetic. There we go. There's a nice cupcake to paint. Okay, so when you're taking a design from your sketchbook to another painting surface, there are lots of ways to do it. You can use transfer paper, some people use fancy projectors, but today for this project, we're just gonna rough in a pencil sketch. And also, there's a lot of ways to do pencil sketches on your painting surface as well. One way people do it if they need more details is they'll rough in their pencil sketch with as many details as they want, and then they'll put a really thin layer of gesso or varnish on top of it, and that way the pencil won't go anywhere when you paint. Again, we're not going to do that this time. I'm just going to rough in the basic shapes because there's not a ton of detail that needs to be penciled in with this particular cupcake. All the details and highlights and things can be done with paint. So we just need the basic shapes. But you do have to be careful because pencil will start to muddy your paint if you need a lot of pencil on your preliminary sketch. But we're just gonna kind of get the basic form and the foreground and the background established with this pencil. And we're going to be really light with the lines again so it doesn't muddy our paint. Also, you know, the style I'm going to paint in isn't necessarily realism. It's kind of like a funky, abstractish pop art kind of style. And if you have some sketch lines that show through that, that's just part of your process. And sometimes that can actually add to the aesthetic of what you're creating, especially if you're creating something more modern art style. We also want to try to erase as minimally as possible. A kneaded eraser works better because you can smudge your surface with an eraser just on the back of a pencil like that. Okay, I think that's about all the line work that I need to get started here. I'm just going to shore up the bottom. One weakness I have is I'll make like bottom curves kind of weak, so it'll make my object look less solid. So I always try to double check that when I'm done with my pencil sketch. And then we're gonna see what this paint can do. So this is my first time using Arteza acrylic paint. I've heard a lot of good things about it. To be honest, I've always used paint that's a little bit more expensive, but I want to try a lot of different mediums because a lot of times you don't need expensive things to make really awesome art. And the first thing I noticed about this paint is that it's a little bit thin, but that doesn't mean it's bad quality. There's just more things you can do with it. Like there's a difference between a transparent medium and an opaque medium, and acrylic paint can be both. So when painting with this Arteza paint, since it's more transparent, you're gonna kind of think about it more of a transparent paint. So more like you're gonna glaze different layers on top to get darker values. But also, I think, you know, when I get into it more, you can add different types of colors to it that have different pigments. Like I'm about to add white. White is always a pigment that's going to make your paint more opaque, because it has a lot of like titanium and powdery type stuff to make it white. So if you need to make your paint more opaque, you can add white to it and then add a layer like I'm doing here. And then if you need to go back in with the darker, more transparent paint, you can just glaze that darker color on top of it. I'm going to add some lighter values in the front to kind of give it a sense of depth. I'm going to try to not overwork this because, again, you know, I'm going for a whimsical, modern kind of look. I'm not trying to paint like, you know, a classical oil painter or anything right now. So we're always going to do the background, what's behind the object in the front first, because when you paint on top of it, you paint the object on top of it, you cover up all the little mistakes that you make when you paint your background. It also adds a building up of layers. Painting, especially with acrylic paint, is all about building up your painting and building up different layers to create dimension and depth, and you'll see that as we get further into the cupcake with the shadows and the highlights. So I just want this to be like a nice warm golden color in the background, kind of like something that kind of reminds me of a French yellow, kind of like a golden glowing yellow. So I don't want my foreground, like basically the table surface that the cupcake is sitting on, to look that flat. It's always good to mix or layer different colors together. Like one rule that I was taught by one of my favorite painters that I got to take a painting workshop with, her name is Natalia Fabia. She was like, never out of the tube, because if you mix your colors, they become richer instead of, you know, just a flat color out of the tube. So I'm going to add a little wash of which a wash is like water added to your paint, of that yellow on my foreground to give it kind of that reflective glow. You can kind of see how it glows a little now, even if you can't identify yellow underneath the cupcake. And then now you see, I don't want my background to be just flat either. I want to add some rhythm and texture to it. And so I'm going to add these stripes, and I really am enjoying this glow that I got. So I added a darker magenta to the orange, to the yellow, to make this really nice marigold glowing orange that goes really well with the yellow and behind it. And as you can see, what I was talking about with the with painting the background first, see, we overlap the cupcake a little bit. That's okay, because we're going to paint that cupcake and you're never going to see how that stripe overlaps that cupcake. So we're going to get right into the wrapper of the cupcake first. So there's different ways that you're supposed to approach different mediums. With opaque mediums like thicker acrylic paint or oil, you're generally supposed to work from dark to light. And then with watercolors, it's actually the opposite. You work from light to dark. Right now, it's easier for me to start with the middle tone, and then I'm going to build up the shadows and highlights from there. You just have to see what works for you. If you kind of learn the rules, then you can break the rules. But you want to try to map out a plan of how you're going to make the darker parts and the lighter parts. And if you have to, you know, put down a field of underpainting of the middle colors so you can pull out the highlights and push back the dark parts if you need to, then that's okay too. So here I'm going to just block in some of the darker areas. That's not the darkest shadow I'm going to do, but it's going to start giving me that shape and that form of the cupcake wrapper. And as you can see, you know, my style of the acrylic painting is not exactly the same as the style of my sketch, and that's okay. That's how you learn new things and discover your own style, is how you try to kind of paint things in a few different ways. Alright, so here I'm going to go ahead and try to add a little bit of a lighter part. Again, so I can create a roadmap for myself of where the highlights are popping out and where the shadows are going back into the cupcake wrapper to make the little creases. Also, you'll see me hopping back and forth to different areas of the cupcake because it's important to let your layers dry sometimes. So in the end, you'll see me go back and define some things with some darker colors after I've painted most everything else. So right now I'm going to go in with this brown color and I'm going to start painting the cake. So the cake is underneath the icing and the glaze and everything else. So that's the reason why we're going to paint that layer first. And with the cake layer, I'm going to show you the idea that I was talking about of starting with the darkest color first and then building up the layers to the lightest color. When you do that, you actually kind of build up, the layers actually create dimension. Like as you stack them on top of each other, not only does it create the visual illusion of dimension, it actually creates some actual dimension because the paint will layer on top of itself. So I'm using kind of a burnt umber color, and then I'm going in and blending it with more of a yellow ochre color. It's making, when you blend it, it makes all those medium tones, and then once that's a little dry, you can go in with the yellow ochre without any burnt umber and get a higher tone. And again, in the end, just like I explained about, you'll go in and put some darker parts in the end to define everything. You'll probably go in and put an extra pop of highlights in the end too, to get a final pop of dimension. But right now we're just trying to get the basic layers, the basic roadmap of lights and darks onto the different areas of our cupcake. So next is the pink part of the icing. And again, I'm going to go in with my darkest color, and I'm going to make all the little texture divots in the icing. I'm going to try to make that look like a nice, luscious, round pile of icing on that cupcake. I'm using really bright colors here because the dopamine aesthetic really has a broad mix of really bright colors. It's really interesting to see people embrace color like that. I'm going to make a really light area here in the middle. And we're going to leave these areas alone that we have already painted to let them dry so that they'll be nice and dry for our last layers. And we're going to move on to the dark brown of the chocolate fudge glaze. I want to make the contrast really high between the darkest dark and the highlight on the chocolate glaze because I want it to look different from the cake. We want it to look glossy and shiny and rich and fudgy, not like a soft, spongy form underneath the icing. We want this to look like a melty thing that's melting on top of the frosting. One of the ways I've dealt with this Arteza paint being a little thinner than I expected is to just really lean into those brush strokes. I'm using a lot of paint. I'm using a small brush, so you can't see it like if I was using a giant brush. But for a lot of this, I'm using a lot of paint, and I'm embracing that painterly texture that's going into the cupcake. So here you see me moving on to the next layer because the next part of the cupcake because that chocolate fudge part needed to dry. And now I'm going to add a shadow under here since this part is dry to just create more space more of a sense of space with the cupcake, like it's actually sitting on a table, it's actually in a world that has light and shadows. This is what makes the thin transparentness of Arteza paint very nice, is it allows you to glaze in shadows like that, and it creates a different effect than if you just had straight opaque paint. And as you can see, like I talked about, going in after the fact and making some darker areas, really defining the little like pockets of the cupcake wrapper around the surface of the cake. Trying to get those to really look like they stick out. Like if you were to reach out and touch it, it would feel like that ridged feeling that the cupcake wrapper has. Now that all the layers are dry, these highlights are really starting to pop, and the cupcake's looking really round now, which is what we want. So when I put in final details of a painting, I tend to like really stylized looking highlight lines and things like that, kind of like a graphic kind of cartoon or comic style. So you'll see me on the chocolate glaze and on the in a second on the cherry, you'll see me use just really graphic white lines and dots to create highlights. And that's a personal stylistic choice of mine, but you could blend your highlights a little bit more and it would look less illustrative that way. It was really challenging to try and define this whipped cream and let it come out from the background, because, you know, whipped cream is a little bit of an off-white, and that yellow is just more of an intense, kind of in the same family as off-white. So again, I tried to use lights and darks to create areas where it has ridges and pockets of depth. With the cherry, we're going to use that same technique of darkest to lightest. So when you make a lighter red, you don't mix white in it because you'll end up making pink. So when you want to lighten red and get a nice variation in your reds to create a nice round red object in a painting, you want to lighten your red with yellow. And if you need to add white, make sure that you're deliberately making it opaque or deliberately making it a little bit magenta or pink. I added a tiny bit of white in the lightest part, and I feel like it tied it into the pink in the icing. And I don't want to overwork this stem. I just want to indicate the stem, stick a highlight on it, and leave it alone, because the last thing you want to do is overwork a really small part of your painting. It's been so fun to watch this come together and create dimension. I think it needs something else though. What am I missing? Oh, that's right. Sprinkles. We need sprinkles. Sprinkles are really fun. Again, they really hit my spot of that stylized, just using lines and dots to create, to indicate different design elements in my painting. And I really feel like these sprinkles just gave the painting the last finishing touch it really needed. Some little sparkles on the sprinkles. There we go. Now I'm happy with it. Thank you so much for joining me on Arty Field Trips. If you like this artwork, I have an Etsy shop with originally designed stickers, so you can check it out in the description below. If you like what you saw here, please like and subscribe.